The Sciencing Podcast, Season 1, Episode 1. Hi everyone, we are delighted to kick off the first episode of the Sciencing Podcast brought to you by Evonik Animal Nutrition. My name is Faazi, I'm Director of Sustainability at Evonik Animal Nutrition and your podcast host today. In this episode, we're going to explore what sustainability and animal protein production means. We'll start by looking at the science of sustainability and why it's important from an environmental perspective. Later on, we'll talk about why sustainability is good for business and good for investors. And finally, we'll discuss what this all means for the animal nutrition sector. I'm delighted to introduce our two expert speakers who are going to guide us through these topics today. We'll be hearing from Maria Lettini, Executive Director of the FAIRR Initiative, and my colleague Stefan Eils, Director of Sustainability Development at Evonik Animal Nutrition. So Maria, we'll start with you first. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and about the FAIRR Initiative?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Faazi, and I'm really delighted to be here today to speak to you both. So, my name is Maria. I'm the Executive Director of the FAIRR Initiative. We're a global institutional investor network. Again, that probably seems a bit of a foreign phrase for most of your listeners. But what we do essentially is produce research and practical tools for institutional investors, for the likes of the JP Morgans, Northern Trusts, Allianz, Fidelities, and the pension funds who look to asset managers to manage their assets, whether that's Aegon or Viva, Strathclyde pension funds here in the UK. And really, what we do is provide research and tools for those investors to better understand the financially material risks and opportunities in the food system, so they can take our research and tools and begin to think about how to incorporate them into assessing investment risk across their equity, credit, private equity portfolios. We've been around for now just over 5 years. We're a growing investor network, meaning investors can sign up to be members of our network and then have access to all of our tools. And we focus in on global protein supply chain. So really in the sweet spot that we'll be talking about here today.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction, Maria. It's really interesting to know that some of the sustainability issues that we see in our sector have important and material consequences, not just for the environment, but also for investment value. So that's something that I really hope we can come back to later. But first, I'm also going to move on to our second speaker, Stefan. Thank you also for joining us this morning. Could you tell us a bit about what you do at Evonik Animal Nutrition and your background?
Yes, of course, Faazi, I'm happy to do so. Thanks for involving me into this kind of a podcast. Really happy to join here. From my role, I'm actually not a nutritionist coming to that role. I'm a chemist working for the company Evonik since 23 years, also engaged in pharmaceutical intermediates and also products that we are making for the animal food chain. But since 10 years, I'm working now for animal nutrition and actually started with a project where we developed algal omega-3 fatty acids, particularly for the aquaculture value chain. And that has the great opportunity to get involved with really all the players and stakeholders along the value chain, as cooperation and collaboration is really crucial in order to move things and get things forward. And in that project, we work with feed producers, salmon farmers, retailers, NGOs, and certifiers in order to create a vision for the benefits of alternative omega-3 ingredients to replace fish oils and overcome overfishing issues in the industry. So with that as a background, I also took over another role in animal nutrition as a product manager for probiotics, which is a product group that is supposed to replace antibiotics and AGPs in animal production. And that also is a critical issue in this whole value chain, as antibiotics overuse can create antimicrobial resistance, which is an issue not only in animal production, but also finally for human health. So you see, I have some exposure on sustainability improvement projects in our value chain that also finally brought me to the position I'm having right now as a sustainability development director in our sales and marketing business, where we are supporting clients to improve, to identify and improve their position and the overall animal protein production.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stefan. I mean, it's pretty clear that you have a wealth of knowledge across so many topics in our industry, whether it's sustainable agriculture, antibiotic resistance, now working closely with our clients to improve their sustainability performance. So I'm really, really looking forward to hearing from you and learning from your expertise today as well. So I guess what I wanted to start with is to ask you, Maria, why sustainability is relevant to the food industry and why it matters in particular for animal protein producers. I think the link between climate change and fossil fuels is now very clear. Everyone understands the role of oil and gas in climate change. But what does this have to do with the food sector?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's just now, investors, consumers, other stakeholders, even companies are beginning to understand how food system is really contributing to environmental and human health outcomes, right? And I mean, we've spoken quite a bit, Faazi, in the past about this concept of planetary boundaries, right? It's this sort of representation of this operating space within, the Earth system processes. And if we extend beyond those, we could generate sort of irreversible environmental change, right? Even endangering, human existence. So, I mean, all of these planetary boundaries across, a number of different issues are really linked to the diversity of life on Earth. And, when we looked at this complex interconnected system, and now, there's 9 sort of planetary boundaries, and all of them are sort of teetering on the edge of being high risk or moving into the risk zone, right? At FAIRR, we look across really 9 major risk factors when we think about animal protein. And actually, 6 of those planetary boundaries really have significant links to animal protein production. So we're talking about things like you mentioned, like water use, GHG emissions, waste and pollution, antibiotic use, the role that animal protein plays in deforestation and biodiversity loss. And it's, really striking. So, I mean, it's really important, I think, that we're talking about this issue today, because when you start thinking about issues like how we're producing animals for food, how we're consuming food, how we need to be thinking about, and again, your sweet spot of technology and innovation, and you throw in geopolitical crises, that compiled with climate change risks, biodiversity risks, water security, food security, all pose really potential threats to financial and economic stability, right? And when you think from an investor perspective, right, it is their essentially fiduciary duty to be able to understand, comprehend, integrate these risks, and make good choices for the stability of and growth of their own portfolios. Really important that they understand these, because they can translate into various other forms of financial risks. And that affects companies, right? It affects governments, access to credit financing, impacts on equity markets, which affects companies as well as beneficiaries, retailers, pension fund holders, and affects liquidity squeezes and operational risks to companies. So it's really important we understand these food system risks. Food impacts environment much more than I think investors and other stakeholders realize. And, we talk about some of those high level risks of planetary boundaries, but, significant contributor to deforestation, one of the major users of antibiotics in the world today, the, number one user of fresh water on the planet, producing more waste than the entire world population. All of these come with some significant challenges and also opportunities for companies like yourself, as well as food manufacturers, retailers, to actually be able to benefit from thinking in an innovative way to help address some of our challenges that the food system has today as we move towards 10 billion people and looking to meet significant sustainability challenges.
Okay, I guess that makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, if we are to start seeing, certain regions of the world run out of fresh water available for them to use, that's bad for business. And I guess that will eventually have a knock-on impact on investment value. And when it comes to the issue of antibiotic resistance, if we're no longer able to treat common bacterial infections with antibiotics, that's going to have an impact on global health, on global productivity, and that will eventually have a knock-on impact on the global economy as well.
And if you think about, not to interrupt you, but I mean, I think this is also, a real incentive for more innovation when we're, talking about crises like we have today in terms of, in terms of commodities. If we're relying on major feed crops such as soy and wheat, and we're not thinking about how we can be resilient in the time of crisis, that has significant implications that we're living today in terms of food basket prices, right? So we need to be thinking in alternatives. We need to be thinking outside the box, and we need to move away from business as usual.
It's time for transformation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as you mentioned, Maria, we're actually starting to see those crises impact people today. Food affordability, especially in the face of the Ukraine and Russia war, is a real problem worldwide, and it's only exacerbated by these issues of climate change, of water scarcity. I mean, Stefan, what's your view on this? Can you tell us more about the impact on people's livelihoods and on food security?
Yes, indeed. I really appreciate that you took the example of the planetary boundaries principle as a compass in order to identify where are the issues and where can we contribute with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, nitrogen flows, biodiversity loss, and so on. But indeed, when we also look into the global demands and the needs of societies, we pretty much also see two other topics related to food and feed. And the first one is, of course, the food security and affordability, which is let's say, particularly in the current war situation, somehow increasing intensity on this topic. But we generally see that with growing populations in South Asia and South America, but particularly sub-Saharan Africa, that the number of people that are exposed to extreme poverty and even hunger and malnutrition will increase most likely over the next decades. And that this is a critical topic. Also for the animal protein industry. Of course, you can say, well, not everybody must eat a steak every day. But on the other hand side, protein supply is also crucial in areas where nutrition is endangered or critical. And therefore, part of the nutrition has to come from affordable and sustainably produced meat products. And that is one of the key challenges we see for the next years to come, and where animal nutrition and the feed industry can support a lot. The other topic that we often hear when we talk to customers in the regions is food safety is also still a concern that we are not recognizing so much in our societies here, but a pollution-free food system and cold chains that are avoiding contaminations with bacteria or other pollutants is really critical in some areas of the world. Also, pollution-free in the aspect of not being overexposed to antibiotics is a topic where still a lot of improvement can be made in certain regions of the world that we do not have to underestimate. But then, of course, it comes to the big responsibility of the participants or stakeholders of the food value chain to really look into the environmental requirements, being it greenhouse gas emissions or also nitrogen flows, which are to a very high extent caused by agriculture that is done for animal feed production. And therefore, there's a big responsibility and a big challenge. And of course, also opportunity. I mean, that is in the end why companies like Evonik and the peers are trying to deliver solutions in order to improve the sustainability and efficiency of animal protein production.
Thank you, Maria and Stefan, for your great input so far. We'll pause here for a little while, and once we're back from the break, we'll come back to some of the important points you've mentioned.
A blue planet. Almost 8 billion people, and rising. Especially in Asia and Africa. There will be almost 10 billion of us by 2050. But it's not just the population that is growing, prosperity is too. And with it rises the demand for meat. The more prosperous the population, the greater the demand. Since 2000, the international meat market has increased by 110 million tons. Chicken is the most consumed meat in the world. It takes around a kilo of soya to produce 1 kilo of poultry meat, plus other animal feeds. The truth is, the bulk of soya farmed today is used as animal feed. And demand is constantly growing. Meeting it requires arable land. Forests are still being cleared to create farmland. The United States, Brazil, and Argentina together produced 315 million metric tons of soy in 2020, about 80% of the world's total. Over the past 3 years, production has increased by 15%, which is equivalent to an additional 60 million football pitches in terms of land use. The impact comes from a mix of rededication of farmland from other crops and clearing of forests. What can we do to counter this trend? As individuals, we can consume meat more consciously. As producer, one approach is to rely on low-protein diets for livestock. Feeds that are lower in protein can help protect resources. Protein is made up of amino acids, and animals need these. But feeding too much protein is damaging for both the animal and the environment. The level of protein in feeds can be reduced before adding specific amino acids, such as methionine. This ensures that animal diets are balanced and healthy, while at the same time protecting the environment. For example, the use of soya in poultry could be reduced by at least 15%, and soya could be almost eliminated in pork production. Measured by the global poultry population alone, this would mean 17 million metric tons less soybean meal, equal to 6 million hectares less land used for soya farming. That is equivalent to 1.5 times the size of Switzerland. This would enable us to remain at the same level of soya production for the next 20 years, despite the increase in the global population. No need for additional farmland. No carbon emissions from burning forests. No monocultures. Less use of fertilizers. Less water consumption. Biodiversity is retained. Ecosystems remain balanced. All of this is already possible today, with amino acids and feed solutions from Evonik. We are sciencing the global food challenge.
Welcome back to the Sciencing Podcast. Before the break, we discussed why sustainability is important for the global food system and briefly touched on ESG investment and the business case for sustainability. Let's elaborate on those points in the second part of our conversation. A lot of reasons here on why we need to act on sustainability in the livestock industry, but there's a lot of competing pressures as well. On the one hand, we have to sort of reduce our industry's contribution to these planetary boundaries, reduce the industry's water use, its GHG emissions, But we also have to continue producing enough food for growing populations. We have to manage these risks to protect future shareholder value. There's a lot of different issues here to work with, and it can be difficult to prioritize and figure out which ones we should act on. I mean, Stefan, in your view, you're working with clients and customers on these issues every day. I mean, what's the role of the animal nutrition industry here? What should we be doing to help resolve some of these challenges?
There is a pivotal role to overcome the issues of food production, or to contribute to better food production. And the reason is that, on the one hand side, the feed of the animals that we are going to produce to have valuable protein is contributing to 70 or 80% of the cost of the animals. And the same is also with respect to the environmental burden that is caused by for the animal feed production. So this is also in the majority coming from the feed ingredients. So a very efficient use of the agricultural products is necessary. And in this way, the feed additives industry can contribute a lot. Of course, also the genetics, the animal genetics industry that is always contributing with new genetic traits to a better digestion of the feed. But on the other hand side, also, there is a real pivotal role of the animal nutrition industry, and the feed and feed additive industry is really critical for a success of transformed animal protein industry, as not only the cost for the feed is the major contributor to the cost of our protein products, it's also the environmental burden, which comes at about 70% also from the ingredients that are used for the food of the animals. And the majority here comes really from the agricultural products like the corn, the wheat, the soybean meal. This has to be used in a very efficient way. And in this aspect, particularly the feed additive industry can help to make a better digestibility, to reduce the amount of crude protein in the diets, and help to use those valuable agricultural products in the most efficient way. There is, on the one hand side, the possibility to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of a feed by balancing the amino acid profile and enabling the best possible digestibility of those ingredients. But it's, of course, not only the greenhouse gas emissions, if we look to the planetary boundaries that are critically imposed here, it's also nitrogen emissions. And in this aspect, particularly a well-balanced diet of the amino acids is very crucial here. If you consider that the reduction of the crude protein in a poultry or swine diet by 1% is reducing the amount of nitrogen excretions of the animals by 10%.
That's really interesting, Stefan, because, that's something that we at FAIRR are really trying to push companies to think about. When we think about animal protein, again, it's, what is the environmental impact? And I think you're right in saying that feed is a significant contributor to both financial risk to companies as well as sort of negative environmental impact, and across a number of different factors, right? So when I think about the aquaculture industry as being quite progressive in thinking about feed innovation, and they're very dependent on marine ingredients, right? And I know you're doing work there. When I think about sort of typical terrestrial agriculture, so sort of, the meat producers themselves, their exposure to deforestation risk, their, the huge amounts of waste that are produced by these systems, as you rightly mentioned, their, innate production systems, which require antibiotics. I mean, all of these major issues that pose significant risk to the industry and really produce very substantial externalities that increasingly investors are becoming much more aware of in terms of supply chain risk. for us really points to the fact that innovation and new technologies are really important. And I guess I'd like to hear from your perspective, if you don't mind. I mean, because you work across this industry and obviously you are providing them with a lot of these solutions. What's the uptake that you're seeing? Because when we talk to investors and when we talk to companies, there's a real excitement about the having options to shift away from, some of these, again, I would say potentially antiquated and antiquated practices. But it seems like it's moving very slow. What from your side do you think is sort of holding that back?
Yeah, I think indeed that particularly the feed additive industry is very active in delivering innovation on the, let's say, improvements that are necessary for the entire food protein production. This is coming from, as the products that I mentioned, alternatives to omega-3, alternatives to antibiotics, amino acids, probiotics, but it's also alternative protein sources like insect protein, like single cell proteins that can replace existing ingredients that may not be so sustainable or not available in the large volumes any longer. So there's a lot of innovation coming. And that is also then bringing a countable or detectable benefit to the industry. I think what are the major holdbacks? On the one hand side, it is really the knowledge and the communication along the value chain that these ingredients are contributing to a better sustainability of the product. So it's not so visible for the consumer in the end, and the consumer has to decide between so many options that he has, coming from the best nutrition, the best sustainability, and maybe the best animal welfare. So there is a lot of topics that the consumer has to decide on. So on the one hand side, it is really the knowledge and the education. Then it's about, okay, who is paying for what? Yeah, of course, alternative solutions are very often meaning a relatively small premium for the products that are in the end ending up in the shelves. But it's not so clear, as there are so many stakeholders along the value chain, who is going to pay those little premiums and transporting it in the end to the consumer, who may be ready to accept those little premiums, at least in certain societies, if we are not talking about endangered food supply. And so it's really about the collaboration of the stakeholders along the value chain to find a common benefit in the end, to demonstrate our value chain is doing something and is contributing to better food products. So that is my most, let's say the main takes on this.
That's interesting. I reflect and think, maybe it's this idea of, valuing nature and valuing the positive impact that a lot of the shift towards innovation can actually produce, right? And equally, I can't see it going any other direction with all of the, the necessity to reduce emissions to meet net zero targets. When you think about certain countries that are absolutely reliant on agriculture as a main driver of their economy, but yet have to begin to reduce emissions and think about new ways to address some of their issues. I mean, it feels like companies like Evonik would be like perfectly positioned to help meet, as you mentioned, sort of nitrogen reduction targets, methane reduction targets, emissions reduction targets, while still being able to provide protein for a growing population.
That is what we are trying, and that's where we are trying to contribute. And you are also raising another important point. The metrics of this kind of sustainability measurements are still in the development phase. We as Evonik, we are quite advanced to measure the impact of our interventions on, let's say, the production of a kilogram of poultry meat or salmon fillet or so on. But the metrics and the methodologies are still in the development, and also the databases are still having gaps. So that is also a challenge to give a real clear and transparent picture in the end to a consumer what he is buying.
Yeah, I mean, this conversation that we're having around sort of who pays for these solutions and how we work together on the value chain, with the value chain on this. I guess, Maria, you kind of touched on this point, and so did you, Stefan, about how we value environmental impacts, because at the moment that's not priced into food production. So, I mean, sure, it might cost a little bit extra today to pay for an ingredient that has a sustainability benefit. But if we think about the costs in the future of environmental damage, the costs of not having enough water to grow crops for food or for feed, and the disruption that causes to the food supply chain in the future, I mean, if we had a better understanding of those relative costs of investing today versus environmental externalities in the future, I mean, do you think that would help sort of advance the sustainability agenda and push companies to progress faster today?
I think so, absolutely, Faazi, right? I mean, now, the way we're currently producing animals for food is, relatively inexpensive, right? What becomes much more expensive is valuing the externalities, right? And that also at this juncture means that margins of food production begin to be reduced. Someone is, going to have to bear, as Stefan mentioned, the cost of transforming to some extent how we're producing animals. And I think that's quite important. But the knowledge that brings is, again, pointing to what Stefan says, means that we're going to have to bring together a collaborative group of actors that actually begins to address different parts of this value chain, right? And one actor shouldn't have to bear the burden. But suffice to say that, once these externalities, begin to become better known, more valued, and become a real reputational risk for companies, you'll see investors move away from that sector. So, it's about, access to capital and denying capital in many ways. And it's going to be those companies that are more progressive, that are out in front of regulation, that are going to be winners in this game, I think.
Well, what we see is that there are the first initiatives coming up to somehow get or create more transparency on the true value of food, and including the externalities and the extra costs that are coming up for the environment, also for the human health system. And if we continue with certain production methods, being it over pollution with nitrogen excretions that have to be filtered off the drinking water again, or being it the usage of antibiotics that are creating then costs for the healthcare systems in the end, if antibiotics are no longer working in the human medical systems. So those externalities are caused by the animal protein chain, and only the first investigations are going on how big those externalities are. So there are first projects on the true value of food. There are first retail chains who are picking up the topics and making a double pricing on what is the price of this kind of protein, but what would be the price if all externalities have to be encountered. This is just as a start. I think more consumer education has to take place. But it's the move in the right direction to continue with that as well, in order to allow, in the end, the consumer a choice of or somehow price in the issues that are co-created with the production of that protein.
I think consumers are becoming more aware, right? I mean, mostly because a lot of these externalities are happening right in their own backyard. If you live next to a pig farm in the U.S., in North Carolina, you are living day to day the externalities of that pig farm. You have the odor that comes with the farm. You have the manure that's produced in mass that seeps into your waterways, as you rightly point out, Stefan, that brings with it not only nitrates, phosphates, as well as antibiotics, right? You see the incidence of of disease around the communities around these farms. And so, consumers are starting to understand the risks in these systems, but more because they're seeing it from, negative news stories, or their housing prices reducing in value, and raising kids in areas that they think will lead to poor health outcomes. So I think increasingly you'll see consumers much more aware of the environmental impacts. Certainly, they're becoming more aware of the climate impacts. And equally, we think that it's time for government also to have a more active role in this space, right? To some degree, we want consumers to change their preferences and to make the right choices. But consumers, are busy people, and they can't be, and in some cases, for economic reasons, they can't be making specific choices around their food. So, we would also, highlight that government has a role to play in pushing the industry in the right direction to incentivize the uptake of innovative practices to support that transition, and to look at it not just from a do no harm standpoint, but how can we look into the future and ensure that we are actually promoting and incentivizing and driving a shift in the food system, which is essential to underpinning every aspect of our economy.
Right, absolutely. And sort of tying that back in with Stefan's point earlier, that a lot of the biggest environmental impacts of animal protein production actually come from the feed stage of the value chain. You mentioned earlier, Maria, that investors are not just looking at how environmental issues can create risks in the animal protein industry, but they're also using this information to try and find opportunities as well. And in your experience, do you think that the animal nutrition industry can provide the opportunities that investors are looking for? And is there more that the industry can do to communicate the potential that we have to improve performance on these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think investors are excited about the animal nutrition industry, right? And they want to make sure they cover the risks, but they also want to be, investing in the solutions. And we think that diversification into other proteins, non-animal protein, is a great way to do that. We are excited about different ag tech opportunities. We're excited about innovation in feed, and we're excited about innovation in ingredients, and the implication and the impact that looking at that industry can really have on the whole global supply chain. So, I mean, one of the things, and we've already discussed it, is how much of an impact can shifting to some of these alternative ingredients have on the outcome, not only on the environmental and social outcomes, but on the bottom line of the companies. And I think that is an important factor in this. And also an important factor goes back to how do we incentivize the shift in the market, and where, we would go back to thinking about how government subsidies are used, or government incentivization could be used to help transform the system.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I guess we've heard so many different perspectives from our two speakers today about why sustainability is important for the livestock industry. Starting with the scientific perspective, Maria told us about the planetary boundaries and how animal agriculture is actually a significant contributor to many of these, such as climate change, freshwater use, nitrogen flows. So there's an environmental imperative to improve on sustainability there. But not just from an environmental perspective, it's also important for business to make sure that we can continue to produce enough food for growing populations in the future, so that we can protect investment value in the global economy, protect the value of our pensions and other financial assets into the future. And then finally, thinking about how the animal nutrition industry can sort of act on these issues and provide solutions, opportunities that can really reshape how we're performing on some of these issues today. And it was really, really interesting to hear from both of you on sort of the potential of valuing externalities in the food sector and thinking about how measuring what we could call the true value of food and putting, say, a dollar figure on some of those sustainability impacts could really, really help mobilize the value chain to improve on sustainability and work together on some of these complex issues. So I think we'll wrap it up here for today. That was a really, really interesting discussion. I mean, are there any final points that you'd like to share with the audience? Stefan, maybe we'll go to you first.
Yeah, actually, just maybe to wrap it up as well, and what is the vision for the future, and what are still the challenges that we have to cope? Well, we touched it to some extent. I mean, there is certainly also in the beginning a communication issue for the entire, animal protein supply chain or value chain. I mean, on the one hand side, there is huge progress in the efficiency and the availability of protein, like poultry products or swine products globally. And the efficiency is increasing like hell over the last decades. On the other hand side, the reputation of the industry is still very bad. On the one hand side, with respect to environmental burden, working conditions, but also animal welfare. And here, I think a better communication of the strength and transparency on what is really going on would help to create trust at the consumer level. Also, somehow prolong the license to operate for the animal nutrition and animal protein industry to get trust back from the consumers in what we are doing is good and is helping the planet and will also improve or has the potentials to improve over the requirements to become more sustainable. So I think that is one of the major things. The other thing is, and we touched it also earlier, the connectivity along the value chain. We do not have a transparency really of data and knowledge along the value chain between the hatchery, the feed production, the animal farmer, and the slaughterhouse, maybe even the retail, on which is definitely creating a loss of efficiency in order to align really on the sustainability KPIs that can be observed and can be monitored along the entire value chain. So that is a task that we are trying to address with the so-called precision livestock farming, where we try to integrate all those players along the value chain and offer a more transparent data exchange, which will definitely open a lot of efficiency potentials that are currently not met here.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I mean, I suppose I would just close by saying, we have a real opportunity here. Yes, Stefan mentioned there is a lack of data disclosure and in some cases engagement by a lot of the protein producers. I mean, what we haven't mentioned is really this is a truly global sector. And from an investor perspective, some companies are really actively engaged in dialogue with investors. That makes for a very rich discussion about operational risks and operational solutions and what their strategy is going forward. Other companies in other parts of the world don't have a similar culture of engagement with investors that's quite as open, or they don't openly disclose data and information into the investment community. And I think that's an important aspect. A real open communication with the investors and other stakeholders in the market to understand really where the challenges are across jurisdiction. This is a very place-based sector. And each location or geography has to address a lot of these issues in a very specific, bespoke way. And that goes straight across the value chain there, right? So not just the producers, but how it affects the local economies, how the regulators are going to react, and what solutions will be available in those markets. And equally, I really see the ESG lens as lending a real opportunity for us to affect change in the sector, not only from the risk perspective. When we've seen investors engage on issues like deforestation, we've seen some responses from global corporates on how they are implementing policies and tracking deforestation. when we've seen, engagement from investors on overuse of antibiotics in the livestock supply chain. We've seen the ears perk up from large global retailers, restaurants, and fast food chains. And we've seen the real ability to begin to reduce overuse of antibiotics. And I think we can use those examples as we think about evolution in food ingredients as well. Investors, as I said, are keen to understand these risks and incorporate them into their portfolios, or again, as Stefan mentioned, lose their license to operate in many cases. But there's also an opportunity to be leaders. And transforming the food system obviously needs those leaders, and investors will then begin to value those companies much more highly. And that's where you'll see the flow of funds begin to migrate. Those companies who will be resilient into the future, that are addressing a lot of the global ESG risk factors in a meaningful way, and thinking about how we can begin to change current antiquated processes. And that inevitably will create a greater access to capital to begin to transition the food system.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Maria. Thank you, Stefan, for the insightful conversation today. Your final takeaways. I mean, there's a lot for us to think about here. How we can think of sustainability not just as a risk we have to manage, although that's very important, but how we can find the opportunities that it presents to us as well to create value for our industry, for our value chain, and also for investors. So I want to thank both of you for joining us here today, and we'll see you again for our next episode. So once again, thank you, Maria, thank you, Stefan, and thanks to our listeners as well. Well, this is the end of today's The Sciencing podcast episode. Make sure to tune into our next episode. To know more about Evonik Animal Nutrition, visit www.animal-nutrition.evonik.com. The Sciencing Podcast, a production of Evonik Animal Nutrition.
Evonik, leading beyond chemistry.